Welcome back to Purely IFS, a show that aims to support therapists and practitioners in using internal family systems as their primary approach with clients. I'm Gail Williamson.
And I'm E Redfern.
In today's episode, Emma and I will be talking about making the most of IFS supervision and how IFS supervision may be different to supervision that doesn't use IFS.
Yes, I thought it would be good to do an episode on this, partly to clarify some confusion in the community about offering IFS supervision. Also, I'm hoping we can inspire listeners as they give and receive IFS supervision to embrace the variety that IFS brings to supervision.
It really does. The experience I have now, both as supervisee and supervisor, is like night and day from before. Maybe you'd like to tell us, Emma, about some of what you did with your supervisees this week.
Sure. Well, with one therapist to offer level 2 training recently, we explored their dilemma around trying to be more flexible in asking IFS questions instead of almost asking them verbatim, but obviously without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were.
Yes, I tend to encourage beginners to make it easier for themselves and just stick with the set questions to start with, and not to feel like they need to be unique or creative. But then, of course, the more experience you get, the more creative you will likely be able to be in terms of how you ask them, or maybe in terms of additional or spontaneous questions you might ask, while knowing that you will always need to stick to the protocol and using some form of the protector questions if you're offering IFS therapy.
Sure. And with another supervisee, she shared how she links her recent progress with several clients to her own inner transformations recently in her IFS therapy. She's been able to recognise the impact of UBs, unattached burdens, in more than one client's system and confidently help the clients access their self to have the UBs leave.
Wow, sounds like that therapist is doing interesting work. But in terms of what we're talking about today, isn't it amazing, Emma, that as a supervisor, you were attending to multiple systems, your own, of course, your supervisees, her clients, the influence of the training organization, and then even encompassing entities that don't belong in any system.
Yes.
The whole area of unattached burdens is such a fascinating one. Bob Falconer being the expert here and also on spiritual guides.
Robert Faulkner's comprehensive book on the topic came out last year, The Others Within Us. Also this week, a supervisee who is a mature IFS psychotherapist was able to share and celebrate how she can now own some of the IFS laws of inner physics with courage and clarity, and she can offer them in a timely manner and without agenda to the client. I'm thinking especially of the law that nothing on the inside has power over you when you're not afraid of it, and self isn't afraid. Previously, she was unable to know in her bones the truth of that, so didn't share it. And then with an IFS Institute certification candidate, we reviewed concerns they have around some of their IFS interventions, and that led to them detecting several of their own parts impacting the work, who could do with reassurance, befriending, and negotiation to help them relax and constrain the consultee's curiosity less.
You work mainly with supervisees and consultees now, Emma, don't you?
Yes.
But the term IFS supervision isn't recognised or used by the IFS Institute, is it?
No, under the IFS Institute, the closest and only comparison to supervisors would be approved clinical consultants, or ACCs, who provide consultation of those wanting to certify and recertify in IFS. They attend to IFS skill building and the assessment of 8 core IFS competencies. And there are several prerequisites to achieving that designation of ACC, and there's now a centralized application process. So IFSI consultation isn't the same as clinical supervision, and ACCs operate independently of and aren't affiliated with the IFSI directly.
Interesting, Emma. That's good to have that clarified.
So the term IFS supervision is one I use to describe a supervisory relationship outside of America, when all involved have done IFS training. Level 1 with the IFSI or equivalent is what I prefer. And the one offering supervision is trained as a supervisor and is a more seasoned IFS professional.
Yeah.
An IFS supervision, as I call it, also focuses on skills and competence, of course, but it's probably fair to say that IFS supervision, as I know it, will have a broader remit as determined by people's professional bodies and their supervision requirements.
And you've also edited and contributed to the only IFS book so far on supervision and consultation, published in 2022, as well as, of course, your first book on transitioning to IFS that you wrote to support those coming off a level 1 or equivalent training.
Yes, the supervision and consultation book is a multi-author one, featuring an interview with Dick Schwartz and at least 10 IFS lead trainers and other IFS specialists writing about consultation or supervision with their clinical populations or in more general terms.
We'll provide a link to the books in the show notes. But am I right in saying, Emma, that supervision requirements are very different in the US?
Yes, in the US, supervision is commonly the term used for the oversight of trainees, i.e. undergraduates, who once trained can dip in and out of what is then usually called consultation as they wish or need to. Whereas you and I are practicing in Ireland and the UK respectively, and in my neck of the woods, there's an expectation by my professional body that all qualified therapists maintain at least monthly supervision for the duration of our careers for a minimum of an hour and a half, depending on experience and caseload.
Ireland actually seems to be a bit stricter in terms of supervision requirements than the UK.
Mm.
At least in terms of the membership requirements of the Irish Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. Here, if you've been accredited for less than 5 years, the requirement is for 1 hour of supervision per 20 client hours, increasing to 1 hour per 40 client hours if you've more than 10 years experience. I have to say, I do wonder about the wisdom of the US system, Emma. There's a much larger requirement for supervised hours to gain a license to practice there, but there's still an awful lot you don't know when you finish training through any modality that you only learn through years on the job with a variety of clients. And the idea of not having regular input from a supervisor, which is also so valuable in helping us see our own blind spots, doesn't seem like the safest form of practice.
I hear you, Gail. And I think both of us value regular supervision, not just supervision when there's an emergency or an ethical dilemma. When we meet regularly with someone, we build a trusting supervisory relationship and can assist therapists as they deepen into IFS and the 5Ps of IFS self-leadership. I'm thinking of how recently I've offered 2 different supervisees an additional perspective, one of the 5Ps, of course, regarding protective fears. One when I was working with a therapy system, the other when the therapist was presenting a client case.
Could you say a bit more on that, Emma, on the different perspectives that you offered?
Sure, many of us, therapists and clients alike, whose experiences as children were traumatizing, will have protectors striving to stop anything bad from happening, or from making mistakes or getting things wrong, and so on. And it's important to validate that this makes sense. And I'll also offer that such a job is beyond any part's capabilities and always was. That's one perspective I can offer.
Hmm.
Also, mistakes will be made. Bad things will happen regardless of how hard the poor part works. because that's how life and the world operate.
Sure.
But on those occasions, if the party's up for it, self can be with them in any future bad times. So I offer a form of hope merchanting that involves a kind of acceptance of the way life is, i.e., out of a part's control.
That makes sense. It might seem counterintuitive, but actually, I think it can bring relief to parts to have that reality check or that acknowledgement of reality.
Mm.
I'd also suggest that supervision is even more important if you're transitioning to IFS, which is, of course, mostly a postgrad training with only a few places in America, including IFS in undergraduate courses. It's a very complex way of working, as we know, and there's so much you will only learn through encountering a range of parts. But yeah, I do think you need an experienced guide to support you in this, whether through your regular supervisor or through a supervision consultation group. That we shouldn't really be taking someone deep into their internal world without a sound understanding of the maps we use and without that regular supervision.
Yes, and although myself and the first lead trainer in the country, Liz Martins, are doing our bit in different ways to bring on more IFS supervisors and ACCs, there's still a relative shortage of both.
Yes, it really seems there is.
This means that some therapists will have multiple supervision arrangements in place to meet their needs and the requirements of their accrediting bodies.
I've actually heard therapists say that they're in the uncomfortable position of knowing more than their supervisor and having to accommodate this in sessions, and unfortunately not really getting much out of their supervision at all.
So, Gail, if we go back to our experiences offering IFS supervision, what are some of the reasons your supervisees have for being in your supervision groups?
Well, the majority of participants have done the therapist CPD courses in IFS that I offer, and I think they very much view the group supervision as a way of deepening their knowledge of the model and building their skills. But also, they get to share common difficulties of transitioning to IFS and hear that they're not alone. And they get to be with other professionals talking the same language.
And can you give an example of a group session?
Well, someone might be a bit stuck with a client, and as they describe the case and the aspects of the model they've been able to use, I had to be listening out for client parts they may have missed, or parts in them that may be getting in the way, and encouraging the other members of the group to do the same. I might then suggest working with the therapist protector that's blocking progress. Sometimes I will work with the therapist part, or I'll suggest one of the others in the group might want to use the opportunity to get some supervised practice.
And I guess either way, it's very useful for both the therapist bringing their stuckness, but also for the rest of the group in not only seeing the parts detecting in action, but then getting the chance to see the live practice.
Yes, and then other times we've had valuable discussions around, for example, the medicalization of emotional distress, or the nature of self, or contracting and the therapeutic frame. And actually, we had an interesting session last time where a couple of group members, in the course of discussing a client case and the difficulty they were having, mentioned that they didn't see the client on a weekly basis. And instead of looking at the detail of the case, I focused on the therapeutic frame and the lack of weekly contact, which I have to say really highlighted several therapist parts.
So do you mean where therapists are following the client, and if the client says they only want to come monthly, the therapist accommodates that?
That's it, yeah. Despite the fact that we know that therapy is a weekly commitment, or at least I believe it should be.
I hear you, Gail. And for me, this is where conscious transitioning is one of the aspects I offer in my IFS supervision. As professionals, I believe it's important to take time considering what we keep from our foundational psychotherapy learning, such as weekly appointments and contracting principles, and what is jettisoned. Just because IFSI doesn't have their own ethical framework, or because IFS is also a practice for life, that doesn't mean as therapists we can thoughtlessly drop every boundary we've previously valued.
Sure.
And this is especially true when the whole field of psychotherapy is in some ways transitioning. Psychedelic work gives rise to 6 or 8 hour sessions with mini preparation and integration sessions either side. EMDR therapists are offering longer sessions or multiple sessions in a week.
Interesting.
And also, I wonder if the move to online working has had a huge impact on people's willingness to let boundaries slide for convenience sake sometimes.
I think that's where IFS supervision is really helpful, isn't it? Where we can help therapists be aware of the pleaser parts who want to be liked by their clients, or who are trying to avoid conflict at the expense of helpful boundaries, continuity, and measurable progress in the work. So in my group, therapist parts were coming up with various fears. For example, but Gail, if I was to change my practice and tell a client that the way I now work is weekly, they'll feel trapped, but I'll also feel trapped. Or there was a fear that the client will get angry, lash out, and leave therapy. Or even a fear that if I make them come weekly, they won't have anything to talk about. And then they'll get upset at the waste of time, and then they'll blame me. And of course, the thing that IFS supervisors can help supervisees to be aware of is that these fears, all of these fears are coming from our own parts. And that as therapists, we have a responsibility to work with our own parts and ensure that they don't continue to block effective therapy. One thing I've noticed with my supervision groups, but also myself with my own supervisor, is that presenting a case in IFS supervision can be quite challenging.
So many parts.
Yes, so many parts that you may be trying to describe to your supervisor, along with how far you got in terms of the protocols, etc. That it's not just one person you're bringing to supervision and perhaps describing difficulties with all their external relationships. You're often trying to describe maybe 5 different personalities in the one person, along with all their external relationships, etc., etc. So it can really feel like a lot. I think one thing that helps is really taking on board that in IFS, the content is less important than the process of the therapy. I'm not saying that the story or the nature of the different parts isn't important, just less important than the process, the use of our protocols.
And I would add that it's not just to focus on parts in the client or the progress of therapy, it's also about attending to the therapeutic relationship. I'm thinking that sometimes different focus points of supervision, and we'll be talking about the 8 facets of IFS supervision in a little while, are more relevant depending on the experience of the therapist and the maturity of the therapist-client relationship. I know one of the questions I'll often ask supervisees is, what's the contract between you and the client? Often, it's almost like therapists are trying to do IFS as they've seen it in demos on training, where they go with whatever comes up each session.
Yeah.
I find that contracting and creating a working alliance, as taught in initial therapy training or learnt on the job prior to IFS, is still important. The therapeutic relationships often brought to me in IFS supervision are ones in which the therapist can't recall what the contract is. They might look back through their notes and sometimes can't find a record, or what they've written down is more like a shopping list rather than what Chris Burris calls a workable agreement, something agreed and explored together as potentially applicable to individual IFS therapy.
Yeah, I do think the complexity of our clients encourages IFS therapists to take better notes, or at least I hope it does. I'm often shocked when I hear of other therapists not keeping client notes, and I do wonder how any continuity or progress is sustained in the work. During one of the first trainings I attended, I remember one participant who was obviously feeling a bit overwhelmed at the prospect of having to recall all the parts, and they were told that it wasn't important to recall the parts or what was said, but rather just see what comes up each session. And I can't disagree strongly enough. I'm not saying we have to recall absolutely everything. That would be impossible unless you had a photographic memory. But I do think in order to maintain clarity for yourself and your client, you do need to be keeping track of the client's main protectors, how far you've gotten with them. For example, have they been updated yet? And also maybe keeping a note of the exiles you've met and how far you've gotten with them. For example, have any unburdenings taken place yet? I'll often read back my notes from the last session's parts work to the client too, which can be really valuable, particularly for those people who often don't recall what happened.
Yes, that's fairly common, isn't it? Where often because someone is so deep in their unconscious talking to parts, that there's little memory when they return to the outside world, or they may have a protector that makes them forget the session, or they forget to check in during the week with the part as they've promised to.
Sure, but then if you're able to read back some of your notes, what it does is it connects the client straight back to the parts they met, and they usually, really start remembering everything.
Sure.
So, as with IFS therapy, there isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of what therapists bring to supervision. I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners, Emma, how do you handle that diversity in the role?
Great question, Gail. I'm all for having a map of the terrain, which is one of the things that came out of the IFS supervision and consultation book. People sharing their own maps for supervision and consultation. Also, I'm all for bringing IFS itself into supervision in various ways, including through role plays, facilitating the U-turn for therapists to go inside and meet with their own protectors, sometimes even exiles if we're both up for that.
Yes, I guess IFS supervision is perhaps unique in that aspect, where we'll often do substantial work with therapists' own parts who may be blocking them with their clients. Of course, in traditional supervision, the supervisee's own process in terms of countertransference would be discussed, but I think it would be more a case of identifying it for a supervisee with the expectation that they will then take it to personal therapy, whereas in IFS supervision, we can often be the one helping a therapist to get to know their own parts that come up in relation to their work.
Yes, I would see that as one of the 8 facets of IFS supervision, which is the main map I use to navigate and reflect on the diversity of practice.
It would be good to say more about that, Emma, about the facets, I think.
Yes, so the 8 facets of IFS supervision, as I called them, are inspired by the 7-eyed model of supervision. So in a nutshell, they are facet 1, self, the game changer of IFS, facet 2, the client system, facet 3, the supervisee system, facet 4, the supervisor's system, facet 5, IFS itself and the flow of the model, and facet 6, the therapeutic relationship, facet 7, the supervisory relationship, and last but not least, facet 8, the wider systems or contexts of the therapy. And there was an interesting piece of research on the 7-eyed model published in 2022, which states that the mode or facet, the 5 supervisors engaged with the least over the 6 months of the study was the client-therapist relationship.
Which really seems quite odd, doesn't it?
Mm.
But that was a study which we'll also reference in the show notes that also found that only about 12% of the supervisor's speech focused on the supervisee in terms of general well-being and professional development, with little focus on the supervisee's responses to their clients. Supervisors also rarely focused on exploring their supervisee's beliefs or value systems in relation to their work.
And I think if research were carried out to analyse where I focused as an IFS supervisor, then I would much more frequently be inquiring about the parts resonating in the therapist, including perhaps getting to know their beliefs and values. And I'd be referencing parallel process dynamics too.
Me too, Emma. I noticed that probably the most common therapist part that gets in the way, though of course it doesn't mean to, it's trying to help, but it would be the figuring out part. It's the part that often gets very stressed when faced with a complicated or overwhelmed client. It starts trying to help the therapist feel more in control by trying to understand everything that's going on by itself. For example, it will be trying to understand why a part is doing what it's doing, instead of allowing the therapist's self to be curious and flexible and guide the client to go inside and ask the part.
Yes, I see that a lot too. And I notice it gets in the way of accurate parts detecting, where, for example, and through no fault of its own, a figuring out part lacks the perspective or flexibility of self. A figuring out part might see 3 or 4 separate parts, when on checking inside, there's only one. After all, parts are multidimensional beings, and a part that could be labelled from the outside as a pleaser or a rescuer might show up in a person's life in multiple ways, by putting others' needs first and theirs last, having a tendency to be compliant, living in fear of conflict, and attempting to avoid anger at all costs.
Yeah, I have to say I've learned to collaborate with my own figuring out part,
Mm.
where it's often in the room with me and a client. I really don't think it's the case that we need to have all of our parts outside of the room. That's too much pressure. But when my figuring out part is with me, I will be aware of her coming in with ideas, for example, and I can take a moment and decide if it's something I think would be useful to say or not. Or sometimes I'm basically saying to her, we might say that, but let's just wait a bit and see what happens. Or if I notice I'm feeling quite overwhelmed by everything in the room, then I'm able to notice her and just ask her to trust me to be patient, calm, and curious. But it's okay, we don't need to know everything right away.
I love that, girl. It speaks to how helpful our parts can be, and that we don't have to leave them outside the therapy room all the time. I'm thinking of the concept of parallel process, when a part or parts in one system resonate with a part or parts in another system, usually out of awareness. In my experience, drama triangle dynamics are easily paralleled across systems, and it's important that as supervisors, we're aware of our own parts and able to detect those in our supervisees who might want to rescue, blame, or fall into helpless victim to the client or to us, the supervisor.
Rescuer, victim, perpetrator being 3 points on the drama triangle, of course. Trauma-driven roles that we may fall into as we attempt to get our needs met.
For example, a therapist comes to supervision voicing frustration with a particular client and their work together. The supervisor uses words like, she won't do X, or I just can't do whatever it is with him.
They're stuck in blame or persecutor on the triangle.
And on further inquiry, it seems this frustration in the therapist parallels how parts of the client are voicing frustration with therapy, maybe saying, I'm not sure about this IFS. How long is this going to take? So the therapist and client are both frustrated, and they're also both sending messages of wanting rescue or fixing.
Yes, both trying to recruit someone into the rescue or fixing role and actually inhabiting the victim and persecutor corners on the triangle almost simultaneously.
That's it, girl. And as a supervisor, if I lead with a rescuing, fixing part, which I might do sometimes, I will go into problem solving mode with, have you tried A? Have you tried B, C? Which oftentimes falls flat as the supervisee rejects the rescue with, yes, I've tried all that, very politely, obviously. And they might begin to blend with their frustration at me. Ideally, I wouldn't then move around the triangle and unleash my frustration, but perhaps noticing the rescuer, I would ask it for more space inside so I can speak for my parts with a process comment. That might sound like, I've got some drama triangle parts active here in the moment, and I'm wondering if those dynamics might be going on in the therapy relationship or in your therapy relationship. Can we explore that together somehow?
And just making that comment might be enough for the therapist to have more space inside their system, because parts like to be noticed, I find. Or together you could map the parts in the various systems.
Or we might use the room technique and help the therapist do a U-turn to be with their parts. And if my drama triangle parts can't or won't give me space in sessions, I have been known to stop working with someone in supervision, because getting to know these protectors is still a bit of a work in progress for me too.
Sure, but I do love the drama triangle, so useful.
So thanks for joining us again. Next time, we're going to delve into the fascinating area of how parts affect our health.
I'm looking forward to it. We'll have some interesting examples to share.
Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.